Why should 535 people in Washington be entitled to issue commands to 300 million others, and why should the others obey? Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today, I am so happy to be joined by Matt Zwolinski. Got the chance to meet him at IHS seminars about maybe 10 years ago. It's really a pleasure. He's a philosophy professor at the University of San Diego and the director of USD's Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy. Mr. Zwolinski, where's the best place to find your archive of research?
Almost everything I've ever published is on my webpage. So if you just Google Matt Zwolinski, thankfully I have a relatively unusual name. That page should pop right up, and you can just click on the research tab, and you'll find all my papers linked and publicly accessible there.
Well, those links will be in the description below. I'm very excited for your new book with John Tomasi. It's regarding a history of libertarian thought. What is your thesis or approach in this book?
Well, a big part of what we're doing in the book is just trying to convey a sense of how surprising and diverse the libertarian intellectual tradition really is. So in my experience teaching about libertarianism, talking about libertarianism with other academics and with students, with members of the public, a lot of people see libertarianism as a distinctly American doctrine, and they see it as a doctrine that originated really in the 20th century of the United States. So people like Robert Nozick, people like Ayn Rand, people like Murray Rothbard, these are the names that jump to mind when people think about libertarianism. And what we do in this book is we show that it's actually much deeper and much less uniquely American a phenomenon than that. So we trace libertarianism back to the middle of the 19th century. And we argue that it really sprang up originally in Britain and France, and that the American libertarian movement was only a later phenomenon, and really a very different kind of phenomenon than the sort of libertarianism that we saw in 19th century Britain and France. In fact, oddly, if you look at 20th century American libertarianism, those big names that everybody knows, like Rothbard and Rand, that looks a lot more like British and French libertarianism in the 19th century than it does American libertarianism in the 19th century. So there are a lot of surprises in the book, a lot of interesting asides about what libertarians think about democracy, what they think about egoism versus natural rights, what they think about intellectual property. I learned an awful lot about libertarianism just in researching this book, and I've been identifying myself as a libertarian since I was something like 18. So hopefully there'll be a lot in there for our readers to learn from as well.
I think there's a lot of value in researching history. So, for example, when we hear progressives say, well, needing a license to vote will make it harder for people with lower incomes to get access to the license. That's more barriers to entry that will hurt those who are impoverished, which is, yeah, libertarians have been saying that regulations and barriers to entry hurt the most impoverished and give us less access to, fewer goods, higher prices, and gives us oligopolies. So I really am looking forward to reading this. When you were doing research, were there any things where you really saw a clear overlap where, let's just start with libertarianism and conservatism? Were there any times where you said, oh, this is really a point that they agreed on, which we can go back to and sort of build a relationship because there is a historical connection here?
Yeah, so as we saw it in writing the book, over the course of the 20th century in the United States, libertarianism became progressively more and more aligned with conservatism, with the right wing of American politics. And all that started around the 1930s. So the origin, I think, of the libertarian conservative political alliance in the United States was really opposition to the New Deal. Both of them saw FDR's New Deal program as a massive and unwarranted expansion of government power. They were worried also about the international ramifications of FDR's policy. A lot of these people on both the conservative wing and the libertarian wing were isolationists, at least militarily, right? They were all for free trade internationally, mostly, although there were some elements on the right that were opposed to free trade as well. But generally speaking, they felt we had no business getting militarily involved in other countries' affairs. And so they saw FDR's expanding government power both at home and abroad in ways that were deeply, deeply troubling. And so that alliance between libertarians and conservatives in stopping that expansion of government power, we think lasted most of the way through the 20th century. There were some times during that period where certain individuals within the libertarian and conservative movements tried to forge an even deeper alliance between conservatism and libertarianism. So there's a guy named Frank Meyer, for instance, who's somewhat famous for having originated this idea of fusionism, which attempted to forge an alliance not based on mere opposition to government power, but on a set of shared values and moral commitments. Because Meyer thought that, look, I'm all for free government, free markets and limited government, but you can't have those things in a vacuum, right? They require some kind of moral underpinning. And in particular, they require individual commitments to ideals like responsibility and community. And so libertarians really need to take on more of those values, more of those traditionally conservative values, if their support for limited government is going to be sustainable. So there's a really interesting literature, like in the 1960s, 1970s, of debates back and forth about this fusionist project. And it received a lot of criticism, both from libertarians like Murray Rothbard, who thought that it was giving too much to the conservatives, and from conservatives like William F. Buckley, who thought that libertarianism was this crackpot ideology that conservatives should have really nothing to do with.
How about any overlap between libertarianism and progressivism historically? Did you come across any possible signs of how we could build a coalition with them?
Yeah, and that's one of the elements of the book that actually might be the most surprising to a lot of people, is the tremendous extent to which there are historical instances of alliances or connections between libertarians and progressives. And you see that all the way back to the very beginning. In fact, maybe you see that more in the 19th century than you do in the 20th century. So for instance, if you go to 19th century France, one of the most famous libertarians of that era was an economist, Claude Frédéric Bastiat, who was a theoretical economist, a pamphleteer, and also a politician. He served in the French government for a while. And we had these political terms, left wing and right wing. Those date back to the French Assembly and sort of represented where you sat, literally. Did you sit on the left as the people who were opposed to arbitrary government power, or did you sit on the right with the people who wanted to conserve, the aristocracy, the old way of doing things? And Bastiat literally sat on the left. He was a libertarian who didn't align with the conservatives, although he had a lot of economic points of commonality with conservatives. He actually chose to sit on the left with people like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was a socialist, and Louis Blanc, another kind of famous French socialist, because on his view, they had although they disagreed about a lot of means for achieving human freedom, nevertheless, they agreed on the goal of human freedom. They agreed that both Proudhon and Bastiat, for instance, thought that government power was a hindrance to human freedom, and both of them wanted to get rid of it. Now, they wanted to go in very different directions after they got rid of government power, but both of them saw the government power as it existed in that particular context in France as a threat. You see the same thing in the United States. A lot of the libertarians in the late 19th century United States actually identified themselves as socialists. So you have people like Benjamin Tucker, who wrote that he's a socialist, not a state socialist. So he drew this sharp distinction between voluntary socialism and state socialism. Voluntary socialism he regarded as kind of an ethos of cooperation that opposes capitalism as it existed in that particular historical context. So Tucker, along with a lot of other people on the left, thought that capitalism in the United States in the late 19th century was essentially a rigged system, that it was rigged in favor of the landlords, the owners of property, the capitalists, and against the working man and woman, right? That the working man and woman were being unjustly deprived of the products of their labor by government, by this kind of collusion between government and business. And so he united with socialism in opposing that system. But what he didn't want to see, of course, was a kind of massive state takeover of the means of production, as people like Karl Marx did. So it's just interesting, right? Like, you would never see a libertarian in the 20th century United States identifying themselves as socialists, because automatically they would be kind of lumped in with defenders of the Soviet Union and the Chinese regime. But in the 19th century, this was before all those massive state socialist enterprises had gotten off the ground, and so it was much more common to see libertarians making common cause with socialists, making common cause with workers' unions, making common cause with advocates of free love and these kind of free thought advocates. So it was a really interesting and surprising intellectual milieu.
Well, they're certainly right about the collusion between big business and big government. I mean, what is the Federal Reserve Act besides a fascist takeover and monopoly of the money supply? And you can even get in trouble for using other currencies, as we saw with the guys in Free Talk Live in New Hampshire, for trading without a license, unverified currency. So yeah, they're certainly correct in that approach. I just want to go over two definitions briefly, so we're on the same page for the rest of this. What is philosophy?
That's a big question. I mean, the etymology of the term is simply love of wisdom, right? So philosophers are people who seek wisdom. Whether we ever find it or not is another question. But in terms of sort of contemporary academic discourse, it's interesting, right? I mean, everything used to be philosophy. If you look at the writings of Aristotle, for instance, he's known today as a philosopher, but he was doing astronomy, he was doing biology, he was doing politics, he was doing economics, he was doing a bit of everything. It's just they kind of lumped all of that into philosophy. As time went on, all of those different branches of inquiry became more and more specialized and more expansive in terms of the body of knowledge that they had discovered or were working on. And as they became more specialized and more expansive, they all started splitting off, right? So biology became its own thing. Political science became its own thing. And so one way of thinking about philosophy is like all the stuff that's left over after people have figured out these little subdisciplines and made some progress in them. Philosophy is the stuff that we just haven't progressed in enough yet to form its own separate academic discipline.
And how would you define libertarianism?
Libertarianism, well, that's another kind of tough one to define. The approach we take in the book it's a kind of a big tent approach, right? So we think, there are a lot of people who identify themselves as libertarian and who are identified by others in the media or in academia or just in popular culture as libertarian. So like, what is it that all these people have in common, right? What is it that Murray Rothbard has in common with Ayn Rand, which has in common with Friedrich Hayek, which has in common with Milton Friedman and Herbert Spencer and Friedrich Bastiat? It's not exactly a belief in natural rights, because I don't think that Milton Friedman believes in natural rights, or at least he doesn't talk very much about it. It's not a belief in anarchism, because although some libertarians believe in anarcho-capitalism, a lot of them don't. So what is it that's the core of libertarianism? As we put it in the book, it's really a cluster concept, right? There are a number of different ideas that are central to the libertarian worldview. And we identify someone as libertarian when they sort of have all of those ideas in their toolkit, right? And that they play a central role in the way they see the world, the way they approach social problems. So libertarians are committed to strong rights of private property. Libertarians are committed to the importance of free markets. Libertarians are deeply skeptical of political power. Libertarians are committed to the idea of spontaneous order, that order can evolve without central direction. And libertarians believe in liberty in the sense of freedom from interference by others. Liberty is one of those words that tends to get used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different political philosophers. And so what's distinctive about libertarians really is, A, the strength of their commitment to liberty. It is more like a kind of absolute to libertarians than it is just one thing among others that they happen to care about, and B, what they mean by liberty, which is not the ability to do whatever you want, but rather the absence of interference from others in your doing what you want. So for instance, just to flesh that out a little bit, you might be sick, right, or physically handicapped in some way, and so unable to achieve some of the goals that you have in your life. That, according to libertarians, isn't a violation of your liberty. It's a lack of ability, but lack of ability and lack of freedom aren't the same thing. And that's important because one of the things that libertarians believe is that liberty in the sense of non-interference is just about the only thing that you can legitimately demand from others as a matter of right.
I was first introduced to your work regarding sweatshops. What have you learned from your research on sweatshops?
Yeah, so I started working on the issue of sweatshops when I was still a graduate student at the University of Arizona, actually. That was one of my first major research projects, and I wound up writing a few papers on the topic. And the approach I took in writing those papers was broadly libertarian, I guess. I mean, I've identified myself as a libertarian, as I said, since I was roughly 16 or 18. And I had a kind of libertarian take on sweatshops when I first came to that issue, namely that these are voluntary-ish economic arrangements that the government should, for the most part, keep its hands off. That was my kind of prior assumption about the view. But I also recognize that there's a lot of really unpleasant and really objectionable elements of what people describe as sweatshop labor. And so the thought that I had in embarking upon this project is there a way to preserve these kind of broadly libertarian intuitions about what the role of government should be vis-a-vis sweatshops, with a recognition of the reality of sweatshops, which is an ugly, unpleasant reality. And so I did that in these papers. I argued for what I take to be broadly libertarian conclusions, but I didn't do so on strictly libertarian grounds, right? I didn't say sort of, let's assume individual self-ownership and full freedom of contract and then derive the legitimacy of sweatshop labor from those conclusions. What I wanted to do was to show people who didn't necessarily share those libertarian conclusions, or sorry, who didn't necessarily share those libertarian premises, that there was nevertheless good reason in this particular case for supporting the libertarian conclusions. And that's something that I like to do in a lot of my work. Is one time someone asked me to describe my research program, and I described it as showing libertarians that they should be more progressive and showing progressives that they should be more libertarian. So the Sweatshops project was one instance of the showing progressives that they should be more libertarians, right? Even if you cared very deeply about sweatshop workers and want the best for them, there's still good reasons to take the kind of libertarian hands-off approach.
So how can sweatshops help the poor escape poverty?
Well, on the micro level, the argument is pretty simple. When a sweatshop opens up or has job openings, people show up for those jobs. People oftentimes line up around the block in order to get one of those jobs. And that tells us something very important. That tells us that from those people's perspective, those jobs are the best alternative that they've got. If they had a better alternative, if they had a job that offered them better pay or better working conditions, or if they had some non-job activity that they felt would be better for them on net, like staying in school longer, right? Then they'd be doing those things instead. The fact that people are showing up en masse to apply for these sweatshop jobs tells us that from their perspective, those jobs are really quite attractive. And what we should take from that as observers is, I think, a kind of deference to their perspective. We might think, as Westerners who have much nicer jobs, that those jobs aren't good enough for any human being, right? Like no human being should have to work in conditions like that. We might think it's better not to have a job at all than to work in conditions that we view as undignified or unsafe. But I think we should be a lot more humble than that in the way we view these issues. And if people on the ground believe that this is the best alternative that we have, then the last thing we ought to do is try to take those jobs away from them by banning sweatshops or by boycotting sweatshops, which essentially might have the same, if it's successful, is going to have the same effect as a ban. And we should be really, really careful about even just regulating sweatshops, because of course, if you over-regulate the sweatshop, you're going to destroy the very incentive that the sweatshop has for being there in the first place, namely that this is a place where they can do business relatively cheaply and increase their profits. We want to channel that profit motive that these companies have in a way that does good for the people that we're concerned to help. And in a lot of cases, the best way of doing that is just to keep our hands off.
Excellent points. As far as historical examples, are there any historical examples we have of sweatshops existing in a country or geographical area, and then over time, no longer existing and them increasing their living standards and sweatshops going to other places as the libertarian would expect? Or is it, as the Marxists tell us, you allow sweatshops to exist, wages just go down and down and down, the worker gets crushed, and the standard of living decreases? Any historical examples we can look to?
Yeah, I mean, look around you, right? We're living in it. The United States in the 19th century was dominated by sweatshops, right? This was the first form of employment in the cities after the Industrial Revolution. As people started moving into the towns, these factories sprung up. Workers were working in working conditions that were quite terrible by today's standards. Women were engaged in textile production, often at home under these subcontracting agreements that existed at the time. Again, the conditions there were quite terrible. Now, of course, we don't have sweatshops. You tell the same story about Britain, right? Britain had sweatshops during its period of industrialization. Now it doesn't, or at least they're a minor phenomenon. Right here in California, we have some things that might be described as sweatshops, often that employ very recent and illegal immigrants who can't look to the protection of either law or economic competition to protect them. But for us, it was a transitory phenomenon. And so the question then is, well, what happened, right? The story that progressives want to tell is, well, government regulation happened, right? We had these nasty sweatshops. This is capitalism run amok. And then government came in and saved the day by regulating a maximum number of hours that people could work over the course of a week, or regulating basic safety conditions at the workplace, right? The story that libertarians want to tell, in contrast, and I think it's the less well-known story, is no, it wasn't government regulation that happened. It was economic growth. It's that we got richer. And when you get richer, you have more opportunities. There's more demand for skilled labor, less demand for unskilled labor. And the opportunities that workers have to find meaningful, well-compensated work increase. And so they can say no to those sweatshop jobs because they've got better things to do with their time now. And so the richer a country gets, right? Think about child labor, for instance, right? Why don't we have child labor here in the United States? Well, partly it's illegal. There is government regulation. But even if it wasn't illegal, I don't think a lot of parents would be sending their kids to work in the mines when they're 13 years old. Why not? Because they can afford not to, right? Nobody really wants to send their kids off to work in a dangerous setting if they can avoid it. The only reason that anybody in the world does that is because they have no better option. They don't have good public schools where their kids can go and invest in their human capital and get a warm lunch while they're there. The alternatives for them are you either send your kid to work or your family doesn't have enough food to put on the table. So economic growth, the the growth of wealth and opportunities available to people, that's really what killed child labor in much of the developing world. So to answer your question, yeah, we have all kinds of examples of countries moving beyond sweatshops, both the kind of familiar examples of the United States and Britain, but even more recently, if you look at where sweatshops are in the world today in 2021, and you compare that with where sweatshops were in the world, say, 30 years ago in 1990, you're going to get a very, very different set of countries. When Nike started outsourcing its production, it was outsourcing it largely to Japan, right? That's where the cheap labor was. They aren't there in Japan anymore, and it's not because the Japanese government regulated them out of existence. It's because Japan got very, very wealthy, and the price for labor went up, and so Nike had to go elsewhere to find the cheap workers that it wanted.
Excellent points. Except on the child labor, I, as a child, was subject to 5 hours of labor a day, 5 days a week for 12 years, and it was unpaid. I got $0.00. Talk about exploitation. As far as price controls goes, that was just a shot at government schools. As far as price controls and price gouging, you make a very compelling case that people should actually second guess themselves when looking at price gouging laws. So if I were sort of just looking at this without having done much research, I might say price gouging is when some people with a lot of institutional or physical power manipulate people in an unjust way where they're already making money, yet because of greed, what they do is they gouge. They really try and stick it to the little guy with little institutional power. Why should people second guess price controls and price gouging?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I like that way of putting it. I like thinking about it in terms of second guessing, because I think there really are some cases of price gouging that fit exactly the description you just gave, and that really are objectionable from a moral point of view. But I think we need to be a little careful in rushing towards that judgment, because often there's more going on in those cases than meets the eye, right? So I think the best way of thinking about this is just to ask, well, what is it that prices do? Why do we have prices in the marketplace? And when you see somebody charging a very high price for, say, snow shovels the day after a big winter storm, what function are those prices serving? The most obvious function, of course, and the one that gets people all riled up is, well, they're increasing the seller's profits, right? They're getting rich, and that's coming out of the buyer's own pockets. And so it looks like a kind of exploitation, unfair taking advantage of somebody in a bad situation. And okay, we can grant that, right? I mean, the money is going into the seller's pocket, but is there anything else going on there? And I think there is, and there's sort of two broad categories of effect at work here that we need to pay attention to. The first of them are what we call demand side effects, right? So prices serve to ration demand. We live in a world of scarce resources all the time. There's never enough stuff to go around to meet people's demand. But when you're in an emergency situation, right, when there's a snowstorm or a flood or a hurricane or something like that, then you really feel the scarcity. Then you really realize that, right, there's not a lot of people here who need sandbags, or a lot of people here who need electrical generators, and there's only so many of those things to go around. How do you decide who gets what? You have to have some way of rationing, right? The fact of scarcity implies logically that some people's needs are going to go unmet. So you have to have some method of rationing. What method of rationing are you going to use? Well, one method you could use are prices, willingness to pay. So you increase the price beyond the normal market price, and you ask, who's willing to buy the snow shovel for $20, or who's willing to buy the snow shovel for $30? All else being equal, the people who need the item more are going to be willing to pay more for the item. A story I tell in the paper involves bags of ice. People selling bags of ice in a hurricane-struck town where there's no electrical power left to generate ice. And there's a bunch of people lined up to buy this ice. Now, you might imagine some of these people want the ice for relatively trivial needs. Maybe they got some beer at home that's getting warm and they want to keep it cold for later on tonight, so they'd like to have some ice around. Other people on the line might have more serious needs for that ice. Maybe they've got a diabetic kid and they need to keep that child's insulin cold, otherwise it's going to go bad and their kid could get really, really sick. All else being equal, the parents who need the ice to keep their kids' insulin cold are going to be willing to pay a lot more for that ice than the person who merely needs it to keep their beer cold. So by using willingness to pay as a kind of rationing mechanism, you can kind of sort out the people who really need the good from the people who could kind of do without the good. It's not a perfect rationing mechanism. There are problems with it, but you got to have some rationing mechanism. And the point I make in the article is, even if there are problems with prices as a rationing mechanism, there are problems with all the other rationing mechanisms too, right? So what's the alternative? You don't raise the price at all, and then you just sell them at their normal market price to whoever shows up first. Well, maybe the person who shows up first is the one who really, really needs it, but maybe not, right? It's just kind of arbitrary. So although rationing by price is imperfect, I think it does a lot better job than any available alternative in most cases of getting the goods to people who need them most. So that's one thing, and I'm sure you got questions about that. Let me just say the other part of the story too, because there's a demand side point and then there's a supply side point as well. And the supply side point is this: you want more of the stuff that people need to get to the people who need it. And price increases are one relatively effective way of doing that. Again, back to the ice story that I tell in the paper, these guys who were selling ice for, I think, I don't know, $12 a bag or something like that in this town that had been hit by a hurricane, they brought that ice in from a few towns over that hadn't been struck by a hurricane and where ice was plentiful, where they could buy ice for $2 a bag, right? So these guys thought, I could buy ice for $2 a bag here. I can rent a refrigerated truck, and then I can go to this other place where they really, really need ice, and they'd probably be willing to pay me like $12 a bag for ice. Mm-hmm. Big profit opportunity there. And it's precisely that lure of profit that brings the resources from where they're not needed to where they're urgently needed. And that's exactly what we want people to do. So prices are solving two problems at once. They're rationing demand, but at the same time they're rationing demand. In fact, by the very same mechanism that they're rationing demand, they're also increasing supply. So you're doing two things at once to kind of bring supply and demand into equilibrium. And that's a kind of abstract economic way of putting the point. A more humane way of putting it is that the prices are helping people to get the stuff they desperately need to cope with the emergency.
Excellent economic approach. Let's take the philosophical approach of positive versus negative rights. So if I see someone selling ice for $18 or $12 in this case, and I might, think, that surely seems like a lot, but again, maybe, they're working overtime coming from towns over and their profit margins are still slim. If I look at this from a philosophical point of view, I'm saying, all right, no one owes anyone ice as a positive right. So for you to offer me ice at $1 or $50, it's at least giving me the option to do something I otherwise am not entitled to. And we could apply this to computers, healthcare, housing, food, shelter, friendship. I'm not entitled to anyone's time. However, if you believe in positive rights, then not only should they lower the price of the ice, but it shouldn't just be ice. It should be all the other things we need in life. How would you communicate or how would you explain the principal difference between positive and negative rights with how we can approach situations like this?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good analysis, and I largely agree with it. A negative right is a right to be free from certain kinds of interference by other people. So I can't stop you from buying ice from somebody else or making your own rice. But you don't have the positive right. You don't have a right that I perform certain actions on your behalf, like give you the ice out of my pocket, or even give it to you for a price that you think is fair. I think that's generally right, though, and maybe this is one of those cases that makes me less than a perfect libertarian myself. I think there are cases probably where you do have a positive obligation to provide others with ice or some other desperately needed good or service. So, for instance, if I was out hiking in the desert, and being the well-prepared desert hiker that I am, right, I came with my full camelback and a couple of canteens full of water, and then I stumbled across somebody else who wasn't so well prepared, or just got unlucky or something, and they got lost and ran out of water. And they're desperate, right? They don't know the way back. They don't have any enough water to survive for the next couple of hours. I think it would be really horrible of me to say, yeah, I'll give you this canteen of water, but it's going to cost you $10,000, right? You could just sign this contract here, because I know you don't have the money with you, but you can sign this contract here promising to wire me the money once you get back home, and then I'll hand over the water gladly. I think that would be horrible. I think that would be immoral and unjust for me to do. And in fact, I think that you do, in that case, have something like a right to my aid in that situation. I don't think that translates into cases that we might encounter in day-to-day life or in questions of public policy. So I don't think that the government should be guaranteeing water or bags of ice to people in the normal course of daily events. But I think in those special circumstances, right, where there's one person in desperate need, there's precisely one person in a position to supply what that person desperately needs, and to do so at relatively little personal cost, right? I've stipulated that this person has an abundance of water on them. In situations like that, I think, yeah, you have an obligation to hand over some of your water. It gets more complicated if there's a bunch of people who need the water, right? Which is what we often find in these price gouging situations. So, if let's say I've set up shop on a street corner with my, 24 bags of ice, and I get 6 people showing up saying, I'd like that ice. What am I going to do, right? One person might raise their hand and say, you know what, I really, really need that ice because I've got a diabetic kid at home. And I think, oh, okay, well, that sounds like a good story. Maybe I should give the ice to them. Then what happens? Then other people see me responding in that way, and they say, oh, I've got a diabetic kid at home too. I've got a diabetic kid at home. And they all start competing now to tell me the best story about why they and only they should be entitled to the ice in my bag. And I'm in no position there epistemically to assess any of these stories, right? I don't know who needs what. I don't know any of these people. So in a situation like that, it's really hard to say that I would have a positive obligation to give my ice to the people who need it most, because I don't know who needs it most, and I've only got so much to give around, so somebody's needs are going to go unmet there. So I think yes, I concede the existence of positive rights in theory, but it's really difficult, I think, to extend from those kind of hypothetical thought experiments to real world practical conclusions, because there's often a lot of complicating factors that get in the way.
Yeah, I don't see how the existence of a lifeboat scenario can give us a universal justification. So, for example, someone breaks his leg, and is it all right if he forces you, with the threat of killing you, to call for an ambulance? If it takes you 30 seconds, you have a cell phone, you're very wealthy, is that justified? Well, what you could look at that as is a form of forced labor and enslavement. So if you justify that, does that mean you justify slavery? I think you once used the example of, is it okay to, without someone's consent, brush up against them in order to save the planet Earth from exploding? So, I can see that there's also a difference in I guess you would call it the epistemic approach. So if you reach for the water, you know that it's water, and you hand it to the guy, and he puts it in his mouth, you can actually see that happening. So the Peter Singers of the world may say, therefore trillions of dollars every year is justified in welfare. Well, how do I know it's not going to departments, or that my time or money isn't just going to, a laptop for some administrator? Maybe the money is being allocated in a way that Otto von Bismarck wanted it to just secure the rule of the Kaiser instead of actually helping the poor. So is it because there's so many other factors that differentiates these, or is it the amount of knowledge that we have with regard to me choosing to fund Medicaid versus me choosing to give the guy water?
Yeah, it's all of the above, I think. One of the big differences here between the kind of hypothetical thought experiments that philosophers love so much, and the sort of real world public policy problems that those thought experiments are intended to shed some kind of light on, is that the hypothetical thought experiments are always static, right? It's always a one-shot interaction, right? So you're out hiking in the desert. There's one person there that needs your stuff, or there's one toddler drowning in a shallow pond, right? Do you pull them out or do you not pull them out? The decisions that you make in these hypothetical thought experiments never have any ramifications beyond the thought experiment themselves, right? And that's not how the real world operates. The real world is an ongoing dynamic process, right? It's an iterated series of interactions. It's not just a one-shot interaction taken out of context on its own. And so when we're thinking about, am I justified in charging a high price for these bags of ice in this hurricane-struck town? I need to think not only about how is charging that price going to affect the people that I'm interacting with right here and right now, but I also think, what kinds of incentives is this going to set up for future suppliers, right, who might want to come, right? How is this going to affect future interactions, not just how is this going to affect the situation on the ground in front of me? Just by their very nature, I think, philosophical thought experiments aren't terribly well equipped to take that kind of dynamism into account. And so, that's one big factor that gets left out of those stories. But I think, as you say, there's a lot of factors, right? A lot of the epistemic, we sort of stipulate things in hypothetical thought experiments, right? We stipulate that the person is starving. We stipulate that you have more than enough. And in the real world, we can't just stipulate those things. We need to discover those things. And often discovering those things is a difficult and time-consuming process that we can't always afford to engage in.
Let's say I am very attracted to social justice. So I see blacks, women, Hispanics, the impoverished, people that are sort of in vulnerable situations in life, constantly unable to act in this world without someone sort of taking advantage of them not being able to live fully with dignity and have the full human experience the Matt Zwolinskis and Jeff Bezoses of the world are able to experience. If I have this worldview, why should I consider libertarianism?
Yeah, good. So this has been a big hobby horse of mine for at least the last 10 years or so now. I identify myself sometimes as a bleeding heart libertarian. I believe in free markets and social justice. I think those things are compatible with each other. And there's a lot to say about that compatibility, I think. But maybe the most obvious and the most compelling thing to say is that often, more often than not, I think, the most egregious violations of social justice are the product of government action, and not something that occurs independently, which we should hope for government action to correct, right? So slavery, for instance, was sanctioned and enforced by the government. The apartheid regime in the United States that followed the abolition of slavery was enforced by government and often opposed by private interests, right, who wanted to sell their products or services to African Americans because their money was the same color as everybody else's. Were prevented from doing so by the state. I was just giving a talk the other day. The Cato Institute has been doing this really, led by Mike Tanner, has been undertaking this really nice project on poverty and inequality in California. And Mike's trying to bring together a bunch of libertarians and a bunch of essentially social justice workers to try to solve a lot of the economic and social problems that have been plaguing California recently. And so in my talk, I pointed to two problems that I think are both very serious problems and problems that really exemplify this thesis that many of the most egregious violations of social justice are government policy. And the two examples I gave were housing policy and occupational licensing. So just to start with housing policy, because I think libertarians know more about the occupational licensing point, but housing is really expensive in California. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows how hard it is to buy a home in California. But not everybody realizes, I think, just how responsible government policy is for establishing and maintaining that state of affairs. The shortage of affordable housing in California is the result of deliberate government policy. We keep housing scarce because that's what a lot of the people in California with political influence want. They want housing to be scarce. Why? Because it drives their home prices up. They already got their house, right? And they view that house as not just a place to live, but as an investment. They want to see that investment go up and up every year. Well, you can't have public policy that does these two things at once. You can't have public policy that both guarantees that the price of housing is going to go up and up every year, and that there's going to be affordable housing for everybody. They're just incompatible goods. And so what government has done is they've responded to the people with political power. They've responded to the people with wealth and votes. And those are the homeowners, not the people who would maybe like to live in California, but who can't afford to live here. And so we've got zoning laws, we've got massive restrictions on new development, all of which have the effect of keeping housing expensive. But it's much worse than that. It also perpetuates racial segregation because zoning is done on this neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And so you have some neighborhoods that aren't explicitly racially segregated, but they're basically designed to price undesirables out of the neighborhood. And so you get this legacy of explicit racial segregation, which we had in California in the not too distant past, which is now being perpetuated by a kind of economic segregation. Because public schools are linked to neighborhoods, neighborhood segregation also results in a kind of de facto educational segregation, whereby Blacks and other people of color are locked out of the better schools in the country. That perpetuates ongoing economic inequality generation after generation. So it's just a terrible, terrible scenario from almost any perspective you can imagine. And it's basically all the government's fault. I mean, it's the government's fault. It's not just the government's fault. It's a lot of people, right, who are pressing the government to adopt policies in the direction because it's in their self-interest. What the government does, though, is the government provides a vehicle for certain economically and socially powerful groups to use the government to advance their own private interests at the expense of the poor and the marginalized. And that's something that I think all of us should be opposed to, whether you're libertarian or not. So it's a great point of connection, I think, between libertarians and the left, broadly speaking.
And there was an example in California, I think his name was Elvis Summers. He was building houses for some homeless people that he knew because he'd take that way to work. And he was able to build them a structure for about $1,000. And they kept it on private property. So it's not like in the middle of a road that, everyone has to chip into anyways. So this was working out very well until the state confiscated it. Confiscated all of these portable houses that were about $1,000 in reference to a movie, Minimalism. You could see people using small houses, just enough what they need. So it's the same philosophy of, we don't allow minimum wages. You can't pay less than 15. Anything less than 15 is illegal. They had the same rationalization in California. Anything less than this standard of housing is illegal. So even if it's on private property, we're coming to confiscate it. This was reported by Reason Magazine. Same thing happened with Jay Austin in Washington, D.C. So these are just explicit examples of how
because I mean, the irony of such regulations is so palpable, and yet people don't seem to get it, right? It's like we're going to say that this kind of house is just too small, too unfitted to be suitable for human habitation, right? So we're not going to allow you to live in that house because we don't think it's good enough for you. But if that means you're homeless, right, and you don't have any house at all, well then, oh well, right? Like that's apparently okay. Just like with the minimum wage, right? It's like we don't want you working for $8 an hour, but if that means you wind up unemployed and working for $0 an hour, oh well. I don't get it.
Yeah, the people offering me nothing are constantly telling me what a bad deal I get with regard to any other interaction I'm involved in. Oh, that's terrible. That's exploitative. They're just using you for profit. Are there any alternatives you have for me? Well, I think we could get Elizabeth Warren in office in 8 years, and then things will really kick in. Well, so I'm homeless and starving in the meantime. That's just anger that's been working up in me. I wasn't even going anywhere with that. You quote John Rawls, and this is sort of an extension. Rawls says, a just society's rules tend to work to the maximum advantage of the least well-off classes. And behind a veil of ignorance, what people would choose to live in a society before they knew their place in that society is one in which there was some sort of guaranteed safety net. Someone who advocates the ideas of John Rawls and see this as legitimate, how would you communicate the value of libertarianism to them?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be said for Rawls's principle. I think that it would be a foolish thing to try to mandate. So, for instance, I don't think that we should have a government committee devoted to examining each piece of policy that comes before it to see whether this works to the maximal advantage of the least well-off in society. I think that would be a complete and utter disaster. So I don't think it's a good rule, but I think it's a good aspirational goal. And it's also not a bad way of describing, I think, what actually goes on in a free market economy. That's why, for instance, you find somebody like Friedrich Hayek, who in many ways is kind of the philosophical antithesis of Rawls, nevertheless endorsing essentially the same principle, right? You actually get this veil of ignorance idea quite explicitly in Hayek, as well as in Rawls. But Hayek thought, like, once you say we should design a society that works to the advantage of the least well-off, it's an open question, an empirical question, right? What sort of society that turns out to be. You can't just stipulate that socialism or property-owning democracy, as Rawls liked to call his favorite system, that is going to work to the maximal advantage of the least well-off. You can't even stipulate that a society where we try really hard to promote the interests of the least well-off is going, in fact, to be a society that works to the advantage of the least well-off. Intentions don't equal results. And what we ought to be caring about here are results, not intentions. So even if in a free market system, nobody's running around intending to benefit the least well-off, that doesn't mean, right, that isn't what's actually going to happen. And in fact, I think that's what does, generally speaking, happen. If you look at the massive improvements in human well-being that have occurred over the last 120 years, let's say, especially among the least well-off citizens of the globe, right? It's not those improvements have not happened because people have gotten a lot more generous, right? Mm-hmm. Those improvements have not resulted because we're giving more to charity or because governments are taxing and redistributing a lot more. If you went back to 1900 and you taxed all of the money that the wealthiest individuals on the planet have at a rate of 100%, and then you just redistributed it all Robin Hood style to the world's poor, they would not nearly be as well off as they are today when none of that redistribution happened. So what explains the difference? Again, we're back to this idea of economic growth. We just got richer. The invisible hand of capitalism worked its magic and made the world a much, much wealthier place. And as much as people like to disparage the idea of trickle-down economics, right, there's something to this, right? The benefits that have accrued to the world's wealth as a whole have been tremendously, and I would say disproportionately beneficial to the world's least well off. And that's why the poverty rate, the number of people living under, say, $2 or $1 a day, however we define extreme poverty in the world, has just plummeted over the last 120 years, even over the last 30 years. This is economic growth, free trade, private property. These are the engines that have been working to make people better off.
Terrific. We might have to turn this into a lightning round, but I do want to go over some philosophers you and I spoke about. I asked you, who are your top 5 favorite philosophers? If we could do it probably in a lightning round style.
Yeah.
Most important thing you learned from or contribution of F.A. Hayek?
Hayek is amazing. He's, I think, the greatest social theorist of the 20th century. The most important Hayekian idea, I think, is simply the limitations of human knowledge and the role of the price system and market economy in facilitating cooperation and development amongst a complex system of interspersed individuals, each with their own particular knowledge of the circumstances of time and place.
Awesome. Most important contribution of Adam Smith?
Adam Smith, gosh, it's hard to pick one with Adam Smith because, of course, Adam Smith is known both for his economic worth in the wealth of nations and less so, but maybe more today than 20 years ago, his moral work in the theory of moral sentiments. And I think both of those are profound contributions in their own right. So economically, of course, I mean, Smith's major point was the way in which the division of labor contributes to the growth of the wealth of nations. And I think that's taken as an obvious point now. But it wasn't when Smith made it, and it's still not as obvious as people assume it is. If you really start to dig in and figure out what exactly that means and what all the implications of that simple idea are, it's really quite profound. In terms of the theory of moral sentiments, I think that offers a way of thinking about human morality and moral psychology that is still underappreciated today, in contrast to the more rationalistic modes of moral thinking made famous by John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant, where we take morality as being exemplified by some master principle, right? The principle of utility or the categorical imperative, and everything else is derived from that master principle. In Smith's view, there is no master principle. Morality is itself a kind of spontaneous order for Smith. It's not something that's designed by some philosopher, but something that emerges out of the complex interaction of different human beings trying to achieve this kind of equilibrium state of sympathy with each other. And I think that's an exciting and really cool way of thinking about morality that not enough philosophers really know about or appreciate.
Most important contribution of David Hume?
David Hume, I just love for his skepticism and his acerbic wit. I think Hume is a great destroyer of systems. Hume is amazing at pointing out the problems, the flaws, the oversights of other people. His own positive philosophical theories, they're good too. I mean, I like them and all, but I just appreciate Hume's skeptical eye. It's an eye I always sort of try to keep in the back of my mind when I'm doing my own writing. Like, what would David Hume think about this? Where would be the problems that Hume saw? But I think he's great, and again, a wide-ranging thinker, right? I mean, we in philosophy see him mostly as a kind of metaphysician, an epistemologist, and ethicist, but he was doing work in history as well. He was doing work in political economy as well, and I thought he often has some incredibly insightful things to say about almost every issue he touches on. So I always learn from reading David Hume.
Most important contribution from David Schmitz.
David Schmitz was my dissertation director at the University of Arizona, so I worked really closely with him while I was getting my PhD there. And I think what I got from Schmitz more than anything was a sense of pluralism and humility in philosophy. The idea that there's rarely just one right way of thinking about any particular issue, especially in his work and the work I've kind of taken on from him in moral theory and political philosophy. The attempt to reduce everything to one simple principle, whether it's the principle of utility or the non-aggression principle, is almost always, I think, doomed to fail. The world is more complicated than that. Our theories are like maps. We can try to map out a certain terrain, and if it's a good map, it'll be a useful map, right? So I can make a map of the city of San Diego that might be useful in finding my way from, my house to SeaWorld or something like that. But that same map that's useful for that particular problem is going to be absolutely worthless if I want to come pay you a visit in Phoenix and drive over there, right? So we need a different map for different purposes. It doesn't mean that those maps are worthless. It just means that their use is a function of their context. And so for different contexts, we need different maps, different theories. And the struggle to find some way to fit those theories together is largely a matter of practical judgment, not something that we can appeal to some master theory to tell us how to solve.
Finally, most important contribution or thing you learned from Lysander Spooner.
Oh, Spooner's another fun one. And him, again, he's not somebody that I find myself agreeing with an awful lot in terms of his conclusions, but he embodies everything I love about sort of radical, uncompromising libertarianism. Spooner will take a premise and he will just drive it home to its most extreme logical conclusion, and he doesn't give a damn what anybody thinks about it. And I love that about Spooner, and he takes it in some very surprising directions too. So I mean, a lot of the stuff is sort of standard libertarian fare, and he was an anarchist who thought the state had no political authority for broadly the same kinds of reasons that you see in somebody like Michael Huemer's work today. But he also had some surprising views, right? So he thought that intellectual property was not only justified, but justified in perpetuity. So if you came up with an idea, you own that idea for the rest of your life. You could bequeath it to your descendants, and they would own that idea. It's a kooky idea, but which like no libertarians agree with anymore. But it's fascinating. He thought that wage labor was unjust, and the only reason that anybody had to work for a wage was because the government was basically holding them down and propping up this system of servitude as he saw it. And he also thought that, I thought that slavery was unjust, which okay, a lot of people thought that, but Spooner really thought that slavery was unjust and devoted most of his career to fighting against it, resulting most famously in this long treatise called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, which is devoted to making a constitutional argument for why slavery ought to be illegal. But he wasn't satisfied with the constitutional arguments. He actually started planning this series of slave revolts that he was going to try to inspire and encourage with this long pamphlet that he addressed, sort of encouraging slaves to rebel against their masters, encouraging non-slave owners to help the slaves out, give them guns. He wanted to. He was worked with John Brown in John Brown's raid After John Brown was arrested, he hatched this plan to kidnap the governor of Virginia and hold him for ransom until John Brown was released. So it's like, you never know what you're going to get when you open up something by Spooner, but it's always a lot of fun.
Thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Zwolinski, thank you so much for being generous with your time.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure talking with you, Keith.